随着西方对外派体系不足以及个人语言化方面，一些国家的学者和作家频繁使用中国原产地词，旨在遮盖语言学的含义。所谓的不同形式论调分为系列外和行动方面。
Hyvänä Xinjiang todella kansallisena namlak akka satman aslinya di nomor dari itu menjadi dari itu bersoalan dari dalam apa radio kursus mesin sana.
So Nathan, I don't know about you, but when I first saw that video, and it was passed to us by sources, we can't go into too much detail about that. But when I first saw it, I knew we were looking at something pretty extraordinary, given everything we know about what's happening in Xinjiang. What were your thoughts?
There were a few things. One was this video, it felt to me was it was particularly timely given the broader conversation about China and its response to coronavirus. That was my initial thought. But then beyond that, I think as we were reporting the story, what really stood out to me was how this video was a demonstration of the degree to which the broader project in Xinjiang, this move to sort of incarcerate people, to re-educate people, to politically indoctrinate people, we've been told that some of that project was over. And we've heard again more recently this idea that sort of people have all graduated from these re-education centers that have been out. But I think what the video showed is that, in fact, the elements of this remain much in place, and that people, even very successful people, Uyghurs, are being still taken from other parts of China and brought back to Xinjiang and subjected to very harsh treatment. From then, I think it was a question, before we did anything, of going to some lengths to try to sort out whether it was true. And I can talk about one element about this, and perhaps you can sort of speak about that as well, and particularly the implications of it, because of course there's a great deal of scrutiny on reporting around Xinjiang, not least from the government in China. One of the elements that I went frame by frame through the video looking for buildings, identifiable buildings that were in the video, and trying to match those up with the neighborhood where Merdan had told his family where he was located. And in fact, it was very clear that there were very obviously identifiable buildings, a trio of apartment buildings that were right next to a partially constructed shell of additional apartment buildings that were very unique and that were located right about where he said he was. So to me, it was important to get that. But perhaps you could talk about some of the other elements we went to and the importance of doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, it was very important to try to verify as much as we could. I think the thing that struck me, having spent time trying to report the story in Xinjiang, both on the ground through reporting trips to the region, but also as many media organizations are having to do increasingly nowadays through secondary sources, satellite photos, testimony from people who have been in the camp system. And of course, all of this vital because it is getting harder and harder, given China's control of the story, its monitoring and obstruction of people trying to report independently in Xinjiang. It's important that we look to these sources. But I think the first thing that struck me, as you mentioned, I mean, the video itself is taken inside a quarantine center, it seems, inside a sort of virus isolation center where Merdan Gappa, this young man, has been moved out of the prison system just as the pandemic in China really starts to take off. But alongside the video are these text messages, a series of extraordinary texts that he's also sending out from that quarantine isolation room. And it was important, I think, for us to try to have a look at those, to examine in detail the sorts of things he was describing, the conditions he was describing, the treatment of the prisoners, some extraordinarily sort of chilling scenes that he describes, this police cell with 50 or 60 other Uyghurs held in the cell, all hooded, handcuffed and shackled. And what we both did as part of this collaboration was to speak to people who have spent a long time looking in great detail about what we know of the system, how Uyghurs are processed through it, and to check with them whether these accounts appeared credible, whether they tallied with the kind of testimony that we've heard before, and indeed they did. And I think reading them and getting them translated and having experts look at them in the end left me more convinced than ever that this appeared to be a very genuine account and a very, very rare personal account sent directly from inside the system.
And of course, it was 2 weeks later that we received a response back from the authorities in Xinjiang, a response that, in fact, verified much of what we had reported about the fact that we had Merdan, a Uyghur man who had been taken from his home in the Guangzhou area, brought to Xinjiang, and had been subjected to compulsory measures, coercive measures. And so, there's been subsequent responses from the Chinese government, sort of, trying to call this fake news and whatever else they've said. But I mean, it feels like from a factual basis, things really have been as they were communicated by Merdan. And I think for me, and I'm sure for John as well, one of the troubling aspects was the degree to which his account in those text messages also comported with other things that I have heard over the years in reporting on Xinjiang. This idea of people held underground, this idea of people cycled through a system in which they go through different sorts of detention. And one of the things for us is that we don't know where Merdan is today. The last we've heard from him was around the end of March, which is when we haven't heard from him, but family and friends have heard from him, was the end of March, and we don't know to this day where he is, and that was simply not something we were able to answer.
One thing I'd be interested in discussing with you, Nathan, I mean, we work very closely on this report, and obviously up close, we are aware of the intense difficulty of getting any information out of Xinjiang today. And it's interesting because I watch the discussion going on elsewhere in the world, in the United States in particular, of course, about the dangers when journalism is under pressure and under attack, not just directly from politicians, but also because of the economic model, the hollowing out of local news, how that in itself potentially undermines democracy. And it sometimes strikes me that there is an opposite danger here in China, because, of course, as part of the foreign media here, reporting these stories, as much as we know how difficult it is in getting this news out, there is an inverse danger that by our very presence, we make this very, very closed system appear open. We can, despite the difficulties, get access to information like this. You can travel to Xinjiang and do the sort of reporting we've seen. And I wonder what you think about that danger in general, and how, as reporters, we guard against being a kind of fig leaf for a system that is, deeply hostile to scrutiny and independent journalism, and yet by our very presence, we make it look as if it's less so.
Possibly, but I mean, if you remember the early days of reporting this story, we had Chinese representatives in Central Asia outright denying the presence of these camps, and then or these re-education centers, these political indoctrination centers, whatever language you'd like to use, and that narrative gradually changed, and then it changed to a narrative of, yes, they exist, but in fact they have been established for the well-being of the people there. And maybe you can speak about that, because I think you, more than most of us here in Beijing, were on the front lines of sort of really trying to peer through what was staged and what was reality when you were invited into one of the camps. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of the approach you took to try to sort of glean something of value, something truthful out of what you were shown.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're right. I mean, you cannot, of course, deny that in the end, there have been some extremely brave and effective reporters working here in China, and despite the odds, getting the story out, and it's made a difference. And I think the way I answer that question I posed is exactly in that way, that if we are here with this unique privilege of being able to do what of course very few Chinese nationals are able to do, report on their own country, we are obligated to work very, very hard to try to get to the truth. And in the kind of reporting that I did, the use of the satellite photos, others have used those as well. But eventually, I think perhaps as a result of the impact that our reporting on the BBC had, we were invited inside the camps about a year ago, given this extraordinary tour of some of the camps, these re-education centres, as they are sometimes called. Although even then I felt the danger very acutely, that of course we were aware that we were being shown what the Chinese government wanted to show the world, and our job of course was to try to hold it up to scrutiny and try to get below the surface and find out what the truth really was. So for example, after we'd been taken to a camp and given the show tour, if you want to call it that, and asked as many difficult questions as we could and went away in the evening, later that night we drove back to that camp and sat outside and tried to glean what we could. We went back to some of the camps in the evening to sort of peer back through and see what we could outside of the official tour, if you like. And I think all of that stuff is really important. I think possibly some of it is at a distance. You're always peering through or over this kind of wall of censorship. And I think for me, what was very strong, obviously, about the Murdan Gappa story that we worked on together was that here was a rare moment where you could actually look into the eyes, unfiltered, of somebody inside the system. Hear his story in his own words being sent from inside that system. And I think for me, that's what was truly extraordinary. And I think really part of the reason it had the resonance that it did.
Maybe just to wrap up, we could talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that do exist, because this story obviously didn't involve us traveling to Xinjiang. We were able to report this from Beijing, but you and I have both encountered some very serious obstacles to attempting to report in Xinjiang on some of our various trips there. I at one point had a laptop that was taken by the Ministry of State Security. I've been tailed. You've been tailed. I think I was tailed once by 4 vehicles. I don't remember what your record was, but I think it's quite a bit larger than that in terms of the numbers of people who have been behind you. But the effort that has taken place in Xinjiang to try to bar people from reporting this is extraordinary. I've been threatened with arrest. I've had photographs deleted. I've had sort of the following presence so close that, I was walking away from my car to buy breakfast and I had somebody walking 10, 15 paces behind me every turn I took, monitoring me. And there have even been sort of faked accidents that have been done to sort of close down roads, like construction sites that have been made to appear out of nowhere to prevent people from going to certain places. So yes, I think there has been, due in no small part to extraordinary efforts by many reporters here in China, some success in getting out elements of the story. But I think it's also worth pointing out the degree to which there have been obstacles to doing this.
Absolutely, and of course they've only become greater as the international scrutiny of what's happening has intensified. So in some ways, it's getting harder to report. Of course, the virus in China this year has added another layer of complication to getting to Xinjiang. I mean, for me, every time I do this story, I think the thing I'm reminded of is, how much we should cherish, the methods and the values of a free press. people, I think that there's no doubt about it. The media, there's a sense of crisis in the media in other parts of the world. The role and function of the media is being called into question. I mean, our reporting is one small part of this extraordinary effort that has gone on. But, what's amazing is despite the best efforts of the Chinese government, the truth is out there. Those who've spent hours painstakingly going through China's own procurement documents for the building of some of these camps, the satellite photos, the analysis of them, the victim testimony, all compiled together, paints a compelling picture of the truth of that system. And that couldn't have been done without, as I say, the values of openness and transparency that a free press brings to a story. So for me, it's a reminder of just how important those things are.